Well, thank you very much for being here today. It's always a good sign when people turn up in this measure for a speech on Middle East politics, which is not necessarily the easiest subject or the most interesting if you haven't engaged with it before. Obviously, there are a lot of issues on the table with regards to Middle East politics in the moment. You think about Israel and Iran is a big one coming up with Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit, but of course ISIS, Iranian political strategy in the region, the notion of American power in the region, post-Iraq and Afghanistan, and the president's strategy. So what I'm going to try and do is touch on a few themes and then leave a good chunk of space for Q&A. And if people don't have questions, then I will expound on a previous point I've mentioned. But I've split my comments today up into three key themes. And the first one is the nature of perception of American power. Because this is a critical point. In the Middle East, probably more so than any other region on Earth, perception of power is very, very important in determining how other states react to the United States, how they develop their own political strategies. And so if you consider the tangibles of American military power in the Middle East, the Fifth Fleet in the Persian Gulf, which always has a carrier group there. Unfortunately, the president has decided to reduce the standard presence from 2 carriers to 1. But we still have a considerable military presence in the region. Our intelligence collection capabilities, both in terms of signal intelligence and mainly through the Jordanian and in Israeli intelligence services, human sources on the ground, are considerable. And states in the region know that. And so that is something that immediately gives us an opportunity to practice our power in ways that are short of war and conflict, but have considerable impetus in terms of how we're able to achieve our policy objectives and make other states and non-state actors react to us. But the problem is, for that perceptive power to have a tangible impact, it has to be realized on the part of American policymakers. And so one thing at the moment that I think is weakening America's power to be a force for peace in the Middle East, again, short of conflict, is the fact that President Obama and his administration are much more concerned with the perception of American power as it relates at the populist level of anti-Americanism, in contrast to how it relates with the leadership of different countries. And this is pretty striking in terms of this is what's behind at the moment President Obama's reluctance to speak about the nature of the rot within political Islam on the Sunni side, which is Salafism, which is an extreme interpretation of Sunni Islam, and on the Shia side, orientated by Iran, which goes right back to the revolution, but on both sides, very authoritarian, very restrictive, and rooted in tenets of Islam. And the reason the president doesn't want to talk about that is because he believes it will greatly upset people in the Middle East, that will upset people on the street, and thus it will alienate people from the United States and drive more extremism and terrorism against us. But the problem, ultimately, is that in the short term, these anti-American sentiments are not going to be able to be resolved by anything the president does in terms of speech. Just today, a source sent me an article, the Iranian Press TV, which is their propaganda arm, and the Iranians have been doing this for about a month now, have been reporting that the US is flying helicopter supplies to ISIS in western Iraq because the Iranians want to essentially push the United States out of the region. But across the Arab world, in the press, in the Lebanese press, in the Egyptian press, the level of conspiracy theories about the United States are so profound and have been going on for so long that anything the president does in terms of speech and trying to placate that audience is going to fall on deaf ears. Again, a big conspiracy that is still manifestly believed is that the 9/11 attacks were committed by Israel, that Jews were told to stay home, and that Muslims really had nothing to do with this. And when you're dealing with that much of a perception deficit, which flows through a lot of other issues that, quite frankly, we don't have time to go into, education, opportunity, it becomes very, very important to recognize the audience that is out there listening to you. But the counterpoint is that if the president would be willing to realize that perceptive ability of American power, again, the tangibles of power, the relationships that we could form with governments across the region now From Jordan to Saudi Arabia, the Sunni Arab monarchies, but Egypt as well, of course Israel, would be far greater and far superior because those nations recognize that power and are desperate for American leadership in the region. Because they know, ultimately, as much as they might say negative things about the United States in public, they know ultimately the United States can be a good friend and is a good friend. And Iran, the growing superpower in the region, is not. And so that leads to the second issue about the practice of American power. We have the perceptive element, but then if we look at what the United States is doing in the region at the moment, it is pretty concerning in terms of the impact on what is happening in terms of political dynamics. The refusal of the Obama administration at the moment to put forward air controllers, special forces on the ground embedded with units of the Kurdish militia, the Peshmerga, Iraqi special forces, some of whom are good, and to arm the Sunni tribes has led to a vacuum of American power in which you have this binary choice between ISIS and the Iranian militias who are turning the region, not just Iraq, the region, Lebanon, Jordan, and now pushing into, as we've seen with the latest ISIS video, the execution of Egyptian Christians in Libya. It spreads absent American power because the worst elements of that political society are able to contest in the ways that they see fit, and the relatively limited applications of American power that would be required. Again, it's this boots on the ground issue. Absent that impetus, absent that ability to deliver force in targeted specific ways and to broadcast perceived intent in physical ways, the vacuum grows and our adversaries fill that space. And the problem, again, is that in the Middle East, the political calculations are not rational a lot of the time, at least compared to our viewpoints. And this is actually a good linkage point between what I was saying earlier about the perception of America on the street, the kind of conspiracy theories. That interacts at a policy level, absent American power, because where America is not seen as a force of interlocutor relationships, as someone reliable in the middle, that's a great way of looking at it, in the middle, being able to build trust on both sides with moderates, people resort to the extremes. So what do you see at the moment? You see fear and paranoia infecting the political calculations of the Sunni Arab monarchies. They are now funding in ways that are more significant than even a year ago, primarily through private donors, but with the closed eye of the government, Salafi jihadists, not ISIS necessarily, although people in Qatar are funding ISIS significantly, but other states funding people in, for example, Saudi Arabia, again in Qatar as well, but the UAE, slightly less in the UAE, Bahrain, funding groups in northern Syria and Iraq, again, who are Salafi jihadists, who are people not ISIS, but close to ISIS. People, let us put it this way, who have a profound ideological hatred for the United States and a mission from God to destroy people's lives, but also the institutions of hope that would go through to the future and to project power against the United States. So our prospective allies are acting now in ways that are counter to our interests, and they openly say this. I mean, I was talking to people behind the scenes. It's let's say it's not open, but it's pretty clear. Any journalist could tell you this, any policymaker intelligence service would say that we are doing this because our fundamental concern that the Sunni Arab monarchies in the region consider is Iran. Everything comes through the prison of Iran. And on the Iranian side, it's vice versa. The Iranians see their arc of power, the intent to spread the revolution, the Islamic revolution across the region. They see that they believe they must marginalize Sunni power. And so the Sunni Arab monarchies are funding extremists now, moving away from the American orbit of support, moving away from the American coalition against ISIS. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has been pulling back some of the resources that it's being applied to that fight because they say they don't see American leadership. They don't see the United States arming the Sunni tribes in Anbar and Deir ez-Zor, who ISIS has been murdering and massacring and enslaving their women, taking away their tribal governance structures. And so I guess my main point here, as I know this is slightly complex, is that there are prospective allies, and American influence is real. But unless the United States is leading in ways that are active, the political calculations of other states go in nefarious ways. That the traditions of the United States as an anchoring force for stability, democracy, but more stability in the region, absent that, pernicious things happen and are happening, and they're getting worse. And the threat of ISIS and Iran is spreading. But it's not just ISIS and Iran. If you look at Egypt at the moment, what Egypt is doing, unilateral strikes on Libya, on ISIS, without the Obama administration support in the aftermath of the murder of the Egyptian Christians, and also a very noticeable visit from Vladimir Putin to Egypt, and a signal there that if the United States is not going to be a reliable ally, we'll look elsewhere. We already know the nature of the relationship between the president and Israel now, and the absolute lack of trust that Israel has in the president's nuclear strategy. But it goes beyond that. So I guess my point here is that there is such a profound issue with American credibility in the region now that our interests and the things that we care about are in great jeopardy, and our security is in jeopardy, which I'll come on to in a minute, because this stuff does not just stay localized in the region. It reaches beyond that, it spreads. And it doesn't just endanger things like stability and trade routes and economics. But the first point to mention is actually, absent that American power, what is happening on the ground in the Middle East with Iran, which is again essentially America's great, long-term power challenge. Iran, ISIS is a serious threat on the terrorism side, but Iran's agenda is to dominate the region, to overthrow governments across the region. Lebanon is the best example, but Iraq, Syria, to create this arc of ordained power in which America is pushed out, in which innocent people are forced to kneel to Khomeini, or to Khamenei as it is now, but it's the original Ayatollah is the organizing theory behind the revolutionary philosophy of Iran. And so what they're doing is, in Iraq, for example, absent American interlocutor relationships, when the United States withdrew from Iraq in 2011, where we had basically won the Iraq War, the catastrophe of that withdrawal was not so much measured in the withdrawal of American military forces on the ground. It was measured by the withdrawal of American generals and senior diplomats at the embassy in Baghdad, who, for years of hard negotiations, had won the trust of Iraqi politicians. And when we withdrew that impetus, the Iranians stepped in, and so now, under the new government of Prime Minister Abadi in Iraq, we see Iran once again at the fore. The Interior Ministry, which deals with a lot of the security apparatus, is basically run by an Iranian proxy, the Badr organization, but it's Iran. And they are massacring Sunnis, which drives Sunnis into the arms of ISIS. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Quds Force commander, some of you may have heard of him, Qasem Soleimani, is every day, or every week at least, photographed running around Iraq, showing himself there, leading the Iraqi army against ISIS. And that matters, because that imagery is designed, because Soleimani made his career killing Americans during the Iraq period around 2006, 7, 8, with explosively formed penetrators. But this is a guy who has an ideological hatred for the United States, as does the government of Iran. And he is now showing himself there and telling Iraqi politicians, look, you can't rely on the Americans because they haven't put those political relationships in there. They have proud disinterest. And again, the president is proud about this. It's this strategic doctrine of relative disinterest, or we wouldn't frame it in that ways. And so it's a binary choice that Iran offers people. Yield to us or die. The ISIS is the same choice, kneel to us or die. And so these worst elements of human society play off against each other. It also reaches, of course, to Yemen. Now Iranian-supported militia, the Houthi rebels, are in control of Yemen. The United States has been pushed out. Our embassy is closed. That is not by accident. Iran knows how to play us, and they are playing us. And again, it matters, because ultimately, as Iran moves towards a nuclear condition, the emboldened sense that they have got from their strategy, from their successes, in the last year especially, means that they are much more likely to pursue terrorism against the United States, and most especially against Israel. But again, it is the United States. In 2011, Iran tried to blow up a restaurant in Washington, D.C. They tried to kill the Saudi ambassador and blow up innocent diners, and they got away with it. Nothing happened. They pay heed to that. When they were attacking American troops with explosively formed penetrators in Iraq under President Bush essentially unleashed Delta Force on them. And a lot of this has not been written about. It's still it's still classified at very high levels because of the sensitivity. But I spoke to a former Delta Force commander the other day, and he said Iran got the message at that tactical level, and it deterred them for a while, and it enabled us to get that influence in Iraq for a while. That has gone now because of the president's policies. It has gone. And on the ISIS side, what we see, again, absent that anchoring American power, is that with thousands of Europeans with the group who is pursuing an ideology that is inherently unrestrained. Salafi jihadism is a global mission. It is not regional. It is about conquering the world and purifying the world of anyone who does not yield. That is their mission. You watch any of the propaganda, you know any of the readings, any of the scripture. These people have no concern about death. If death is the cost of purity in the world, they will pursue it. And so now with Europeans coming back into Europe, we've seen the attacks of Charlie Hebdo in France, massive arrests in Belgium recently. I can tell you as a fact, British intelligence have never been more stretched in terms of monitoring ISIS returners. The big concern for Americans as well is that if you have a European passport, it is not that hard to travel to the United States. And these people have learned the lesson that you don't go to the airport and start shouting Allahu Akbar. You go and you get on the plane and you smile at the customs person, and then eventually you go and do something. And that's what they're concerned about. And Al-Qaeda has tried to do this before. In 2006, they tried to blow up 8 airliners. I don't know if 8 was the exact number, but a large number of airliners over the Atlantic. There is a deliberate intent to sow terrorism both against the United States and the UK, because again, America, they know, is their greatest adversary. And again, as this continues, unless we're able to address our strategy, it's only going to get worse. But there's also a moral component to this. The history of the United States, and as an American who grew up in Europe, I always took great pleasure in educating Europeans about the nature of America's role in the world. But the history of the United States is one of the absolute anchoring force for good in the world. Second World War, obviously the defeat of Nazism and Imperial Japan, the defeat of the Soviet Union, where if the United States was not there, Europe would look very differently today. All these things, you can go back to a litany of examples, but absent America's role in the Middle East, grotesque things are happening. And I'm not talking about a reinvasion, but that the limited level of special forces and political relationships in a realist basis could address some of these things. I just want to read a few quotes, very briefly, that address some of these concerns. For example, this is from an article I wrote about 4 or 5 months ago. It was a stoning video that didn't actually get that much traction. ISIS stoning a young woman. And this is just a quote from it. After they'd done a show trial, videoed. The show trial over, the woman, leashed like a dog, is led by her father to a hole in the ground. ISIS got her father to challenge her, to indict her. As she's tied to the bottom of a pit, other Islamic State fanatics gather around her. It's feeding time. As the victim murmurs quiet prayers, the Islamic State begins to throw stones at her head. And this is the critical point. It's not just throwing stones. They do so with ferocious energy, clearly taking great satisfaction in their murder of a young, unarmed woman. For a short while, the woman cries out in pain, but then, as she falls silent, a jihadist soundtrack offers an ordained climax as the stone throwers complete their deed. It's the same thing we saw with Lieutenant Kassabe, the Jordanian pilot. As he's burned to death, ISIS shows it from multiple camera angles. They play the jihadist music. It's a mission from God. They take pride and pleasure in the murder in this grotesque way. And it shows what their agenda is. This idea that somehow this is limited, somehow it can be contained, somehow our strategy can be pursued in very tidbit ways is fundamentally delusional. And it is borne out by what they do every day. But this has been going on for a while. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, with the Marines crushed in 2004, November, going in there. And if there's any a testament to the man v. man, woman v. woman strength of the United States military against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it is proved by November 2004, where Marines, without really the support of drones, which are much more common now, went door to door and crushed them. But this is what the Marines found. This is from Bing West's book, who's a great journalist on this. They found a nameless woman dumped on a street, arms and legs cut off, entrails eviscerated. What purpose behind that? There's no purpose behind it except, again, purifying the world. But it's also Iran, and this is important. And I'm coming to the conclusion here, and we can go to Q&A, but Iran as well, it's very important to understand the ideology, because the president, especially, believing very much, and there are frictions in the Iranian regime, and we should try to exploit them. They're not all the same. But the ideological essence of Iran's revolutionary project has always been clear. 1984, CIA station chief in Beirut, William Buckley, kidnapped. The description of the videos that then, but he was kidnapped by the Lebanese Hezbollah, the description of the videos that Hezbollah sent over a period of months to the CIA, this is one of them. It's about 7 months into the guys, to Buckley's detention. Buckley was close to a gibbering wretch. His words were often incoherent, he slobbered and drooled, and most unnerving of all, he would suddenly scream in terror, his eyes rolling helplessly and his body shaking. The CIA consensus was that he would be blindfolded and chained at the ankles and wrists and kept in a cell little bigger than a coffin. 2 other examples, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Byron Footy and Alex Jimenez. Just in 2 American soldiers. Byron Footy was 19 at the time. They were captured in 2007 by Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were held for months. When their bodies were found in a shallow grave, their bones had been found to have been broken and restructured. They'd been tortured for months. And some US intelligence believed they'd been taken around to different Al-Qaeda people in disguise to let them terrorize them. These are not people who can be negotiated with. Moderate Islam, yes, and it must be empowered, and there must be an awakening in moderate Islam. But the nature of the enemy is serious, and they are on a mission, and we have to face up to that. And again, it's not about a reinvasion. We lost nearly 4,500 Americans, a lot more with physical and mental wounds. But the basic premise of American leadership in the region, political strategy, interlocutor relationships, taking on the enemy in covert ways where necessary, is critical. And again, as a concluding point, I would simply say that none of this is fair. That again, as an American who grew up in Europe, there is nothing more frustrating to me than hearing Europeans lecture about why America must do this. And they'd love to do that. America provides for the security of Europe and enables them to spend nothing on defense and spend it all on social welfare. Regardless, America has carried the weight of national security. Europe won't do it. The dysfunction of the political realities in the Middle East that I talked about earlier means that they won't do it absent American guidance and leadership. But the fact is, America's role in the world, that's why we're the greatest nation on earth. And again, I am not talking about a reinvasion, because I'm always aware as a 29-year-old standing up here and saying this to you who's not in the military but does have military friends, the costs of an invasion are significant. But my great fear is that unless we develop a political strategy that is anchored on that condition of peace and willing to put into place the power structures necessary for that end, the likelihood of another invasion and another major war in which thousands of Americans die is far, far greater. I believe that. I may be wrong, but that is my genuine belief. And I just guess that the final point to say is that the history of the Middle East, of the world, is that absent American anchoring power, what happens is not just a status quo and things sort themselves out. What happens is that everything we care about, freedom, justice, our own security, drifts further into the hands of those who hate us. And the values that we most hold dear are left to be, as that quote on Al-Qaeda said, eviscerated. So big problems, but if we were able to adopt a different strategy, I think we could really begin to face down some of these issues and secure our interests. But if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
So you got 2 microphones.
Okay.
We'll just alternate between the 2.
Okay.
And,
do you want me to sit down or stand?
No, stay right here.
Yep. Okay.
Tom,
hey, good to see you.
Steve Peck here, Douglas County. Enjoyed talking to you last night. Appreciate your words this morning. I really like how you take it to Eleanor Clift every week. I two questions for you. One, can we prevent a nuclear Iran? And then two, is 2016 a foreign policy election, or can we finally tackle entitlements? If it's a foreign policy election, who's the most, not necessarily the most electable, but who's the person that's ready to re-engage our allies in the way we traditionally have?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephen. Yeah, enjoyed talking with you last night as well. I think the first question on Iran, can you prevent a nuclear Iran? Yes. The problem is at the moment, which is why the diplomacy is struggling, the president's trepidation about even saying the military option is there means the Iranians like to play games. It empowers the hardliners. It doesn't empower the moderates, because the hardliners then say to the moderate, well, look, he's willing to bend over here and concede to our demands, so why would we concede on our own part? But if you were articulating a serious military strategy, which exists, the US military can pull it off. Becomes much harder for the Israelis to do it. I think what will be the key thing coming up to the summer, when this final deadline expires, if there's no deal, which there probably won't be, but if it could be a bad deal, is to put a blockade around Iran. In that way, you have real economic strictures on the regime, but you also have some measure of force protection, because the Iranians cannot deal with the US Navy. They'll just sit the carriers there, and they'll try and send their stupid little speedboats, and the air patrols, the destroyers will just sink them. And you can exert that pressure in that way, and hopefully that begins to move the process forward. But again, unless you are serious about broadcasting that intent to have a credible military strategy bound up within the diplomatic process, the diplomatic process becomes much more difficult. On the 2016 point, I think a fortunate thing is a lot of the prospective Republican candidates have been talking actively about this and recognize that the nature of America's lost credibility in the region is so profound. So I think it's probably too early to say who's the best placed, but I think it's certainly looking hopeful in terms of taking ownership of that dialogue. And that issue. And I, certainly as a younger American, I'm hopeful as well that entitlement reform, as people like you and me, who perhaps not as, or other people who are our age who are not as interested in politics, start to see their Obamacare tax returns and the penalties, the notion of role of government and cost of government is going to become more personal and can be linked to an argument on entitlement reform. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom. This is Kelsey Alexander from
Yep.
Castle Rock. And I just want to mention that I think Tony Blankley would be very proud of you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
But I wanted to ask you, what's your perspective on the Russia-Ukraine situation and
Yeah.
how that all plays into the Middle East situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, I think President Putin has, it's a great example of where America is seen to be in a position of hesitancy. Someone takes advantage. The difficulty is the Europeans are beholden to Putin because of energy. We should be expanding, a great example of why we should be expanding our own, energy supplies and fracking and liquid natural gas and exporting to them, because that will destroy Putin. Because he won't be able, because the Europeans will buy it from us instead. I think the way to deal with Russia at the moment is to do a financial lockout of Russian finance from Western Europe and the United States. Not just for the few people. The president pretends that his policy with sanctions has made Russia's economic downturn happen. It hasn't. That's about oil prices. But if you were to lock out Russian finance from Europe and the US, the kleptocrats around Putin would get much more upset, and I think it would compel his behavior to change. Thank you.
Hi, Tom. My name is Tim Trumbull. I'm from Boulder, Colorado. You are willing to tell the truth about those radical elements of jihadist Islamic reality in the world today. Our president is not, clearly. Most people are not, clearly. The Democrat president, White House that we have right now, administration, nobody tells the truth about it. Really, I think it's a worst case scenario. We have half of America today, essentially, that is in the Democrat camp, unwilling to acknowledge there's even a problem, and who frankly believe that we overreached and it was completely pointless to go into Iraq and Afghanistan under President Bush. They consider him an anathema, even today. It might have been the right thing, they say. No way. I see a worst case scenario here. We are not going to do anything. What is the worst thing that can happen if U.S. foreign policy continues to go in the opposite direction of what you recommend for the next 2 years plus another administration, 6 years?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think it's about as worse as you can imagine. You see a nuclear Iran that uses that nuclear umbrella to unleash Hezbollah, other terrorist groups across the region. You see the rise of the Islamic State across North Africa, infiltrating into Europe, repeated attacks in Europe, fundamental destabilization, civil war in Lebanon as well, because of the big frictions there between the Iranian-supported side and the Salafi jihadist side. So you see the collapse of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. You see the Sunni Arab monarchies funding al-Qaeda more as a counterbalance to Iran. And then how does that interact with nuclear weapons? And I tell you, if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, the Sunni Arab monarchies will pursue it. The Saudi Arabias will get it from Pakistan. And these are not regimes, as we've said, that have rational political strategies a lot of the time. So you have a maelstrom, potentially, of two different sides of Islam that hate each other in an existential way, non-state actors that are pursuing that in their own ways, and that all just hitting against each other. And what happens? I mean, bad is the answer. It's bad. And that's what this comes down to. But if this idea that somehow if we just, and would you hit the nail on the head, if we just sort of say, well, we're going to take a step back here and let them sort it out, and they won't sort it out. They will make it worse. That doesn't mean, that's not fair. That's not just on the United States, and it's an indictment on their political culture. But it is the reality in my mind. So.
Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Sharcy Russell, LPR Board of Directors. Would you for just a second comment on the changing demographics of Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, do you mean in terms of the growth of Islam?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that is something that is, I mean, if you look at the population, the Islamic population in France, the difficulty is, it is not as if the majority of Muslims in Europe are terrorists in any sense, but the problem is, especially with young men, the failure of if there is any proof of the United States, the greatest country in the world and the most inclusive country in the world, it is that far fewer American Muslims are traveling to join terrorist groups than European Muslims. But because of the failure of integration, because of the allowance on the part of European governments of fanatical imams, originally Wahhabi and now Salafi, to say to young men, listen, this is a cause, this is a purpose, it is creating major problems. And it is reflected, as this stuff goes, the propaganda, the sense of ordained purpose, you see that uptick in people traveling, more minds inculcated, and the threat growing. So terrorism, we better get used to what's happening in Europe with attacks. And these groups are aware as well. There are American students in Europe. There's a risk that they will attack U.S. interests. Probably not the embassies, too well defended, but it affects us. But it's a problem. There must be much greater integration. There must be. I have one of my best friends, a guy, Kashif Mahmood, who's a British-Pakistani guy, and he basically goes to war every week at his mosque in terms of dialogue with extremist imams. He doesn't like American foreign policy. He's not a fan of Islam necessarily, but he is a fervent believer that Islam cannot be allowed to be defined by these people, and that patriotism to country is an impetus. And I think that's the thing we have to do. We shouldn't expect necessarily that European Muslims or Muslims around the world are going to share our views, but we have to have that anchor point that patriotism and basic respect for the rule of law and tradition is important, and challenging people in their own community who believe that this is okay.
This is going to have to be our last question.
Okay, so I'm happy to stay around after if people want to talk. So.
Thank you, Tom, for your vision and your information. 2016 really is our challenge.
Your name is?
Hoaxstap. 2016 is really our challenge, okay? We have an administration that has abdicated its responsibility to protect the citizens of the United States. We have a likely Democratic candidate who will not define what her positions are. We have some idea via Benghazi. How do we, or do you see developing among the conservative groups a methodology for extracting this vision from her so that we know who we are voting for?
Yeah, and that, it's going to be important. I think, the key will be to say, this is the reality of foreign policy. Mitt Romney with President Obama in 2012, the foreign policy debate, he allowed the president to play his games where he tries to pretend that it wasn't a mistake, that it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't treat, in Iraq and various issues. But the thing with Hillary Clinton is to simply, you hold her policies against her from Secretary of State. She still says that the reset was great until it wasn't. It's ludicrous. You look at policy in the Middle East, what is happening there? Oh, she wanted to support the more moderate Sunni rebels in Syria, but she didn't. It's about articulating. It's about saying to Americans in a basic way, Hillary Clinton was there in the formative years of the Obama foreign policy. Does the world as it stands now look kindly upon her service or not? And then you articulate your own point of view. And I think enough Americans are pretty clear now that our present foreign policy predicament is not exactly superb. And I think she lacks I don't want to get too personal, but I think she lacks the humility to be able to back off from some of that stuff. So I think she'd probably dig her own hole with some of that foreign policy stuff if it is pushed. But you cannot let people escape. The Bush administration, in some ways correctly, was challenged on mistakes that were made in Iraq. There's no question in my mind that conservatives have to apply that same approach to whoever to Hillary Clinton. So.
Thank you.